Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're undertaking a pretty profound reevaluation of decades of dietary dogma. For the better part of a century, we've basically been told that a healthy life is one of strict restriction. We've been taught to fear dietary fat, to meticulously count every single calorie, and to view any excess weight as this profound failure of personal discipline. But what if the very foundations of that conventional wisdom are just fundamentally wrong? What if the foods we've been told to avoid are actually harmless, and the foods we've been told to eat in abundance are the real drivers of chronic disease? Over the next few minutes, prepare to question basically everything you thought you knew about nutrition.
So why are we starving on the inside? It's a pretty stark question, isn't it? But it points directly to the deep loneliness and the quiet inner conflict of the struggle with obesity. For decades, people who fail on conventional low-calorie diets are told they just lack willpower. They're told they must be secretly overeating, or maybe just not moving enough. They end up carrying this incredibly heavy burden, treating it like a moral failing. But as we're going to see, this hunger, this total exhaustion, it is absolutely not a failure of character. It's a very real biological starvation that's happening right down at the cellular level.
The foundation for our explainer today is Gary Taubes' rigorous, genuinely groundbreaking work, Good Calories, Bad Calories. Through some really meticulous research, Taubes totally dismantles the scientific illusions we have around fat, cholesterol, and weight control. This isn't just another diet book. It's a deep dive into how the medical establishment fixated on a single, unproven idea and essentially led the entire modern world astray. He's asking us to strip away our preconceived notions and just look at the unvarnished scientific truth.
All right, let's jump into part one, the fat cholesterol myth, and how we made a massive historical error.
To really understand our current crisis, we have to look at how traditional, effective dietary advice was basically replaced by a mirage. Way back in 1862, an obese London undertaker named William Banting effortlessly lost 50 pounds. How? By eating meat, fish, and fowl, while strictly avoiding starches and sugars. And for 100 years, that was the accepted medical wisdom. Carbohydrates are what make you fat. But then, in the 1950s, a physiologist named Ancel Keys introduced the lipid hypothesis. He speculated that dietary fat raises cholesterol, which then causes heart disease. Now, despite aggressive pushback from statisticians who clearly saw that his data was cherry-picked, the idea just took root. By 1977, this totally fragile hypothesis became institutionalized law when Senator George McGovern's committee released the dietary goals for the United States. They officially told the public to eat less fat and more carbs. And well, the world was forever changed.
This historical error actually perfectly mirrors an old joke. A man walks up to a drunk, crawling around on his hands and knees under a streetlight. He asks the drunk what he's doing, and the drunk says he's looking for his keys. The man asks, "Did you lose them here?" And the drunk replies, "No, but this is where the light is." Medical science fixated on total cholesterol not because they had definitive proof it caused heart disease, but simply because, by the 1930s, it was a very easy marker to measure in a blood test. They searched where the light was, and they completely ignored the much darker, more complex metabolic shadows of hormones and blood sugar.
Which brings us to part two, the modern tide, or the nutrition transition. As different populations all over the world were exposed to a steady stream of easily transportable Western foods, we're talking refined sugar, white flour, and white rice, their underlying biology was quietly, irrevocably altered. This transition brought with it what we call the diseases of civilization: obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, and certain cancers. Missionary and colonial physicians, people like Albert Schweitzer and Peter Cleve, spent decades treating isolated populations, and they noticed something profound. These diseases were basically non-existent among indigenous peoples living on traditional diets, whether that was purely meat like the Inuit or agrarian like the Kukyu. But the exact moment these populations were introduced to refined carbohydrates, this precise cluster of chronic illnesses suddenly exploded. Based on those specific observations, Dr. Peter Cleve developed a chillingly elegant hypothesis he called the saccharine disease. He proposed that these seemingly totally different illnesses weren't actually separate phenomenon at all. His argument was that refined carbohydrates, the sugar, the flour, the white rice, are the singular underlying cause of all these clustered illnesses. They aren't coincidental. They're all just different manifestations of the exact same metabolic disruption. Now for part three, the internal lock, and how our metabolism stalls.
For decades now, we've been trapped in this really cruel, stigmatizing paradigm of energy balance. It's the idea that obesity is simply gluttony, calories in versus calories out. But the cold, clear reality of endocrinology points to a hormonal defect.
Obesity is not an issue of how much energy you consume. It's a biological malfunction of how your body partitions that energy. At its core, it is an issue of insulin dysfunction.
We've really got to strip away this assumption that insulin's only job is to manage blood sugar for diabetics. Actually, insulin is the principal hormone that coordinates the storage of nutrients. It is the primary regulator of your fat metabolism. Think of it as the master switch. When insulin is present in your bloodstream, it opens the doors of your fat cells to store fat, and then it immediately shuts those doors tight so that the fat cannot escape to be burned for fuel. It literally traps the fat right inside your cells. So here is how that biological trap actually plays out. First, you consume refined carbohydrates, which digest rapidly and flood your blood with glucose. To handle that toxic surge of sugar, your insulin spikes. That insulin acts as a lock. It traps fatty acids inside your fat tissue while telling the rest of your body to only burn glucose. Because the fat is locked away and the glucose gets quickly burned up or stored, your cells suddenly find themselves with absolutely no fuel. They experience real cellular starvation. The result? You become completely exhausted and fiercely hungry, even if you just ate a massive meal.
And that leads us to an undeniable biochemical reality. Harvard endocrinologist George Cahill summed it up perfectly. Carbohydrate is driving insulin, is driving fat. Just let that sink in for a second. It's not dietary fat that makes you fat. Dietary fat does not trigger an insulin response. Carbohydrates do. If you want to empty out those fat cells, you have to remove the lock. You have to lower the insulin. And literally the only way to lower insulin is to restrict the carbohydrates.
Let's move into Part 4, Biological Normality, looking at our evolution and our diet. Returning to health requires us to really understand the law of adaptation. Our biology is basically desperately trying to survive in an environment it just wasn't built for. Our species spent 2 million years evolving on diets of meat, fish, fibrous vegetables, and occasional seasonal fruits. Refined sugars and processed flours, they've only been globally ubiquitous for roughly a single century. In evolutionary terms, that is less than a blink of an eye. We just simply haven't adapted to this unnatural concentration of refined carbohydrates. When we flood our internal machinery with it, it breaks down.
Once you grasp this, the whole tragedy of the modern condition comes into really sharp focus. As the researcher Jay Lemangen noted, it is not a paradox to say that animals and humans that become obese gain weight because they are no longer able to lose weight. We have to start looking at obesity empathetically, not as some behavioral flaw, but as a tragic biological state. The body's homeostatic system has been fundamentally jammed by an unnatural environment. Your body is desperately hoarding calories in fat cells that are permanently locked shut by chronically elevated insulin.
So I want to leave you with this question. If our bodies are truly starving on the inside due to a hormonal lock, how must we redefine our relationship with food to finally set ourselves free? It is time we discard the whole idea that counting calories is a moral test. It's time to drop the exhausting pursuit of starvation diets and let go of the illusions of the fat cholesterol myth. It is time we embrace the actual biological truth of hormones, of insulin, and the profound transformative power of changing the quality of what we eat. Thank you for joining me for this explainer.